going to show you in this video how to pattern cut and how to adjust commercial patterns if you have a big bust compared to your waist and shoulder. If you're using standard sizing and that's your body shape, it can be a bit tricky. You don't want to use the bigger size because it's too big everywhere else. You don't want to use the smaller size as it's too tight on the bust. So you need to make adjustments. So I'll show you in detail how to draft the block and any extra details you might need for that if you're working from scratch, and also how to adjust a pattern if you're buying a commercial pattern that needs adjusting. If you're new to my channel, then hello, I'm Ali and I've been pattern cutting for a long time, since I was a teenager, which as you can probably tell from my face was quite a while ago. So I've done a lot of pattern cutting and I've learned a lot of different tips and tricks that I can share along the way. So I'll go through those in this video. If you're not new to my channel, then welcome back. My bodice block drafting video has been up for a while and I've been getting some great feedback on it, and one of the things that I've been asked a lot about is working with a fuller bust. I've also just done a video on different bust shaping and the question has come up again, so I thought it was about time I do a video specifically on making patterns and adjusting patterns for a full bust. So hopefully I will cover everything that you need to know, and if I don't, then please comment, as I love getting feedback and that tells me what to do next, what people want to know. So let's just get started and look at what I've got. So this is the basic bodice sample from my bodice block tutorial. So it's made exactly as that video shows, and it's just got one adjustment, which, because the proportion of the bust to the shoulder and waist is big, because I have padded it out. I'll take this off in a second so you can see exactly what I've done. I've had to do an adjustment on the armhole and I'm going to show you exactly what I did there. So this isn't included on the bodice drafting video, but it is on my bodice adjustments video if you want to see that. I am soon going to be redoing the bodice block tutorial, taking into account all the feedback I've had over the last 8 months since I did it and adding even more detail on it to make it even better. So this is the basic block. It's got the dart that goes into the shoulder and down to the waist, and you'll see when I show the pattern in a minute that this is a very big dart to accommodate the bust padding, and I'll show you the adjustment I've done here. So this is the sample that I've made with the padded out mannequin. Doesn't look great on the mannequin because, as you can imagine, I've got a very solid form, and then I have literally, as you'll see in a second, padded out the bust. So it's a little bit different to working with a body. So this is what I've done. So if I take one of these off, then you'll see the difference. So when you've got a fuller bust, your shoulder doesn't change. The measurement across here changes a little bit, but not loads. That depends kind of how full your bust is on the top, which sadly, as I've learned, does change with age. So that measurement might change a little bit. The measurement from the side neck point, or it's sometimes called the high point shoulder, down to the waist is going to be a lot longer than without. So if I just measure these, if I measure over the padding, this measures 45 centimetres, and then over this, and bearing in mind this mannequin is actually quite curvy already, although it is petite, it's only 42 centimetres. So you can see that the length of the pattern needs to be longer, and I'll show you that in a second. And then obviously, if I'm measuring around the bust, it's self-explanatory that it's going to be bigger on the side that I've padded out. So we need to add some width. And then the third measurement we need to think about is the bust point to bust point. So nipple to nipple, that is going to change a little bit as well. So you can see the difference between the padded out version and the version how my form is without the padding. So let's now take this one off as well, and I will put on the sample that is made that fits onto my form without the extra padding. So this is exactly the same design. It's the same block with the dart going into the shoulder and going into the waist, but without the bust padding. So I'll show you in a second the difference in the two patterns. So if I put this over here, you can see the difference. This is much bigger. It allows for a lot more space for the bust. But as you'll see with the patterns, the shoulder, the side seam here, sorry, I'm dropping all this, the waist and the neck are all exactly the same. You add the fullness here, you don't add it anywhere else, and I'll show you exactly how to do that on both the self-drafted and the commercial adjustments. It's also known as a full bust adjustment. You might be familiar with that term. So this is the paper pattern for the basic bodice block for my mannequin. So you can see it's already, without adding the full bust, it's already quite curvy. It's got fairly big darts, and you can see the angle here, that there's quite a big bust to waist ratio. And then I'm gonna compare it to the pattern, which is drawn up in exactly the same way from my block tutorial, with the added full bust. So you can see straight away it's a lot longer from top to bottom, and this is why I say you don't just add width when you've got a full bust, you need to add height as well. So if I put the bust points on top of each other, the bust point is slightly higher on the fuller bust version because of how I've put the padding on. It sits a little bit higher, but let's just put that on there, and you can see that there's a lot more width at the side, a little bit more at the centre front, and then it makes the distance longer from the point to the bottom and then from the point to the side neck point. So you've got all of that extra height there as well as the width. When drafting from my bodice block video, I had to make a video that works a kind of one size fits all, but sometimes it needs a little bit of tweaking. So you can see from these two patterns that the shoulder is exactly the same, the neck's the same, and this side seam's exactly the same. You can see it's got a bigger dart under the bust, and that's because the bust to waist ratio is quite different. So that's changed that, and that's very obvious. But if I added up this piece and this piece on both patterns, they would add up to the same amount because the waist is the same. Hopefully this is making sense so far. Now the only alteration I do need to do, because the block drafting tutorial doesn't allow for such a big bust to waist ratio, because what I've done is quite an extreme, and it's going to be not that often that you get such an extreme, is I do need to take a little bit out of here, which you will find that amendment on my bodice adjustment tutorial. So this is my smaller pattern and this is the full busted pattern, and you can see it's made the armhole a little bit bigger. But what you can do, if you look at the front and the back next to each other, you can see obviously the side seam matches up, and when that's positioned straight like that, they should be about the same, or the front should be slightly lower. So if I now put this next to it, you can see this is a lot higher. So even before putting this on, I would know that that's not right and it needs to come down a bit. But it's very tricky working out the darts on a video that has to work for everybody, how to do all of these things. So I can show you now here exactly what's going to happen when you try your sample on and you do this little bit here just to tweak your pattern. Basically, what you're doing is you're putting a dart here. So I'm going to just cut that dart like that. And then I'm going to open this up even more. So you end up with a really, really big, wide dart between the bust and the shoulder. So you can see now what's happening. If I put those like that, all I do is I pull this down like this, and these are now more similar to what these are. So you don't want that armhole to be particularly different. So I'm just going to tape that in that position. And that now makes my top dart here very, very wide. But when you come to making your patterns, you're going to play around with these darts anyway. So don't worry about that for now, that this is what the block's like. So you can see now, if this is the finished pattern now for the block, so you can see the shoulder's the same, the neck's the same, the side seam's the same, the armhole is pretty much the same, and these bits add up the same. But you can see, even though those bits around the edge are the same, and both of these pieces, as much as these are very different to each other, they both work perfectly with this back. I've not changed anything on the back at all. So all the fullness has gone on the bust. I've made a bigger dart. I've added some height throughout the whole pattern. I've added width across the bust while maintaining it to match up to this piece here. So I really hope that all makes sense. There's so much to cover in this that it's hard to explain. So that's all very well if you're drafting your own blocks and making your own patterns. But if you're using commercial patterns, how do you do this? So even if you're not making your own patterns and you're adjusting commercial patterns, hopefully what you've just seen has given you a little bit of an insight into what these measurements actually mean and where they translate from the body to the pattern. And now that I've gone through that, I'm going to show you how to adjust a commercial pattern. So obviously, if you've bought a commercial pattern and you need to adjust it, it could have bust shaping in any direction. There could be all sorts going on. So I've just shown the two most common ways of doing the bust shaping to explain how this works. Again, if you have any questions, then please comment below, because I always answer the questions and sometimes it inspires me to make a new video if the same question keeps arising. So firstly, the main thing when you're using a commercial pattern is you use the smaller size and you add the fullness to the bust. You don't work with the bust size and make everything else smaller. So if you've got a big bust, you're probably used to shopping in a clothes shop and buying the bigger size because you obviously need that to go around your bust and then having to take it in. It's the opposite when you're making something. You can either do it big and you can adjust everything other than the bust, or you can do it smaller and just add the bust. The back will be exactly the same. So let's have a look now at a pattern with a side dart here and a dart going under the bust, and then I'll show you exactly the same with a princess seam which goes into the armhole. So let's go through how you would get from here to here. I'm not going to do it with this block design because you're not going to have a dart really in this position if you're buying a pattern. So I'm going to just draw up a couple of standard patterns, one with a side dart and one with a princess seam, to show you how you would do this modification to add this fullness to a bought pattern. You won't need to do this if you're making your own patterns because you'll get your block right first. But for the many people that are buying patterns and needing to adjust them, I'm going to show you how to do it. So the first thing is make sure you're using the right size. If you were to buy a dress or a top in a shop, you would have to go by the biggest measurement. So if this is your body shape, it would be the bust. You would buy the bigger size and you would make the waist smaller and all of those alterations. When you are making something, if you work from the bigger size, you're going to have to make everything else smaller, and that's going to be a lot of work. So if you're making a pattern, unlike with a shop where you can't add bits on, you have to buy the bigger size and make it smaller. When you're making something, go with the smaller size. So pick your waist size, the shoulder size that is nearest to you, and don't worry about the fact that the bust is going to be way too small. So if, for example, you were a size 10 with a size 16 bust, pick the size 10 pattern and we'll adjust the bust to be a size 16. So let's now trace around this and make a couple of basic patterns, and I'll show you how to do the adjustments to add the fuller bust. One thing I need to know is the difference between the height of my two patterns, and I need to know the bust difference between my two patterns. So for me doing this is actually quite straightforward because I can lay them on top of each other. So the difference in the height is 3 centimetres. And the difference in the width is 2.3 centimetres. And then we can play around with the bust point in a minute. So obviously if you're buying a pattern, you haven't got two patterns to lay on top of each other to get the differences. So you need to know what the difference is in the height. So you need to measure from your side neck point down to your waist on your body, and you need to measure your pattern. So on this pattern, it measures, if I go exactly down the darts, 39.5 centimetres. So let's say, for example, on my body, I measured 43. This difference here is the difference in height that you need to add. And then on the width, obviously, you can't just layer them up and see the difference. You need to compare the pattern to your body. So let's say, for example, you had a body measurement of 120 centimetres and you had a pattern where the bust, if you measured all the way across the back and the front, measured 100 centimetres, then the difference is 20 centimetres. You're obviously only working with half your pattern because you've got half of the back and half of the front. So divide that in half and that gives me 10 centimetres. So I need to add 10 centimetres onto this pattern piece on the width. Obviously that's quite an extreme difference. I've added 20 centimetres on, but I just wanted to use some nice round numbers to give an example. So that's what you would have here as the width. So they're the only two dimensions that we want to add to. We want to make it longer, we want to make it wider, we don't want to change the armhole or the shoulder or the side seam. We need to just play around with it to do that. So I'll show you now how to do it. The bust point is going to move as well, but I will discuss that when I do the adjustments. I've traced off the block that doesn't have the added fullness on the bust, and I've made a pattern with a side dart and a dart below the bust, and I've made a pattern for a princess seam that come from this directly. So the first thing you'll notice on this one is that the darts, I've drawn 2 different darts. I've drawn 2 in the straight line to the bust point. If you're buying a pattern, you're not going to have darts that go all the way to the bust point. You're going to have darts that sit just short of that bust point. And then what you need to do, if you get the halfway point of this one, so that's 3.4, so if I draw that at 1.7 and I draw it through the end of my original dart, it takes me to there. If I do exactly the same on this side one and extend that, that shows me where that bust point is. So I've now drawn both of these darts to the new bust point. So what I'll do is I'll rub the bits out on the inside, so we've just got those to work with, or it's going to get very confusing with all these lines. So this is now the pattern we're going to work with. So let's put this aside for now, and I'm going to keep this here because this reminds me that I need to add 3 centimeters to the height, so it's 3 centimeters from top to bottom, and on the width 2.3 centimeters, so from centre front to the side. So that means I'm adding 4.6 centimeters in total just to the width of my front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut up one side of this dart, and I'm going to cut up one side of this dart, and that separates this piece here. So you can see now I've got a part where I can add to the length and I can add to the width. As I add to the height here, it means that these don't match up, but don't worry about that. I'm going to address that in a second. The next bit is to cut a line from the armhole to the point. I'm afraid I've already cut that because I didn't like what I said when I did it, so I'm re-recording it. So you basically need to just cut from the bust point to the armhole, leaving it connected just by a tiniest little bit at the armhole, and then that swings around like this. And then what you need to do is you need to play around with these pieces now. So I think the best way for this demonstration to avoid any confusion is actually to cut the other side of this dart off, and then you can see exactly what's what. So I'm going to cut out that dart, and I'm going to cut out this one, and then you can just see exactly what's what. In practice, I wouldn't normally cut these out, but I think that's a lot clearer to see. So now that I've cut those darts out, that's basically what we had. I've cut that dart out, I've cut that one out, and then I've cut up to the armhole. So that can now swing around, and that means you're not changing the armhole. You don't want to change that, you just want to add the fullness here. So I need to play around with this to add the height of 3 centimeters here and the width of 2.3 centimeters across here. So again, I wouldn't normally do this, but just to make sure things don't move, I'm just going to tape this to the desk, and then that needs to swing around, so the width difference is 2.3 centimeters, and I'm going to just stick that down. And then what I need to do to add the height is I need to add 3 centimeters. So I'm measuring 3 centimeters down from the bottom, and that's where this piece here needs to go. So I'm going to line that up with the width there, and I know that's 3 centimeters down there, and I'll stick that down. So that's basically what we've got. So now I've got to this stage, I've added to the height, I've added to the width, I've not changed the armhole, I've not changed the side seam, I've just made the dart much wider. So obviously this is a really exaggerated full bust, so you might not have a dart as big as this, but it's always good for a demonstration to show it a little bit more exaggerated so you can see it better. So none of it's changed basically, other than the width and the height. I just need to make sure this now lines up. So all I need to do, hopefully I haven't accidentally taped this bit to the desk, is I'm just going to cut across there. Because obviously if we're adding height throughout the bust, we need to add it to the centre front as well. And then all I'm going to do at the bottom here is line that up, and at the centre front, if I was doing this tracing it onto some dot and cross paper, it'd be a lot easier, but with it on the desk rather than the paper, it just means that you can see a lot easier what I've got. So that's the finished pattern, and then the last bit is just to work out where this bust point needs to go and where your darts need to line up to. So the best way to do this is just to measure on your body, basically from nipple to nipple, what that measurement is. So the easiest way for me just for this is to measure this, because I know that's the right position on my dress form. This is the pattern that I made where I drew it up from scratch. So 10.5 centimetres from the centre front is where my bust point needs to go. So that brings me to here. I'm going to have to just put a little bit of paper there just to do the bust point. Obviously, if you're tracing this on a big piece of paper, you'll be able to draw on it. So 10.5 across from the centre front is where it needs to go. And then if I look back to this again, from the bottom, my bust point is 17.4 centimetres up. So I'm going to measure 17.4 up from the bottom, so that takes me to there. So basically where those two measurements cross, that's my new bust point. So when I'm tracing this off, I can draw around all of this nice and straightforward. These are my new dart positions on the waist and the side seam, and that's the bust point to where it has to go. So as I said, this isn't how I would normally do this if I'm making a pattern, but to demonstrate, it just makes it a little bit easier. So there's my centre front line. This line is my waist seam, and hopefully, let me see if I can see. Hopefully you can see through this paper to the pattern that is underneath. And this is what I now need to trace off. As I said, I would normally just stick them to the bit of paper and do it like that, but I think this makes it a little bit clearer to see. So I'm literally tracing around the pattern, and this is now my new side seam. I'd obviously do this with a ruler, but it's easier to show you like this. So this is the dart opening here, this is the dart opening here, and hopefully you can see through there, that's the bust point that I worked out. So I don't want to draw my darts all the way to the bust point. As I showed before, I want to draw these slightly further down. So let's draw that to there. And then this one, I'm going to just draw it just a bit short to there. And then when you're drawing your darts in, just make sure that both sides of the dart measure exactly the same length, because obviously we've moved things around a little bit. Oops, not joined that on very well. And I'm going to just draw this one in here, and I'll draw that side. And there we go. That is, if I lift it up so you can see it without the other one underneath, that's the new pattern now with the full bust, and all of these other measurements haven't changed. It's just longer in the body and it's wider, and that point has moved position. And then the last bit I need to do is just draw in the side seam here. So I'm just gonna join that up there, and I'm just gonna hold my finger there to where that point goes. Oops. And that is the new position of the side seam there. So that is the basic side dart and below bust dart position bodice pattern adjusted. If I now just take all of this off here and lay these pieces over what I've drawn, then you'll be able to see the difference. So let's just lay these over here and see the difference. And this is why I did it on the table, not the paper, because it's a lot harder to see. So that is what I did have. So if I put the bust point in a similar position, you can see now, just like what I did previously on the two patterns that I drafted up, there's more height, there's more width, the bust point has moved, but the armhole has stayed the same, as has the shoulder and the side seam. If we lay them like that, you can see that's exactly the same, and so's the waist seam there. We've just added the fullness all to this bust point here. So that's this design. Let's now have a look at the princess seam. So how do we do it with a princess seam? There's obviously all kinds of different designs that you could do this with, but I just wanted to show a couple of the more kind of common designs that you would have. So we're adding 2.3 centimeters to the width. You can see where the bust point is really easily from my dart on here, but obviously you wouldn't have that on a commercial pattern. So you just need to kind of line up where you think it would be. And just make sure this doesn't have a seam allowance on. If your pattern has a seam allowance, you might be better off just trimming the seam allowance off, doing the adjustment and then adding it back on again. So where they meet is the bust point. So let's just draw that line there. And then at the bust point, I need to move this over by 2.3 centimeters. So I'm just going to do the same as before, and I'm just going to stick it to the table just for ease for demonstrating this. So let's line these up at the bottom. And then I'm just going to measure 2.3 across. So that's where that needs to go. So that's added to my width, and then I need to add to the height as well. To change the length of it, I don't want to actually cut into this piece. I want to move it down, but I'm going to cut into this piece. So I've cut across here exactly the same way as I did on the other one. And I need to move this down the right amount. So I'm going to move it down by 3 centimeters, and I'm just going to use my ruler to make sure it stays in the right position. And obviously when you're tracing it on the paper, you can just draw the lines or you can use the dot and cross. So I'm just going to stick that, oh, made a right mess of that bit of tape. I'm just going to stick that in the right position. So I've now added to the height and, oops, and I've added to the width across here. But I need to move this whole piece down now to line up with this. So what I'll do, oh, I've realised I've stuck this one at a little bit of an angle as well. So I am going to just keep my finger here to mark the position. I'm going to take that off. So this needs to stay in position here. And I'm just going to move it down. I'm just going to move it down until it meets up with the ruler. And I need to make sure this position stays in line there. Again, when you've got your pattern paper there, you can just draw the mark. So it now matches at the bottom. So I've added the height to both pieces. I've not done anything with my armhole, and I've added to the width here. So the princess seam doesn't need to be changed at the armhole point because, oops, because the armhole is staying the same. Apologies, I realised that the bottom of that was cut off. So just to show you, basically I was lining this piece up with this piece at the bottom, so you know that that's exactly the same length. So I don't want to change my armhole at all, so these 2 points stay exactly the same. We need to establish where the bust point is, and then we need to just redraw in the seams on both of these. So just like on the previous one, ultimately you'll just trace these off. So it's just 2 nice clean pieces of pattern rather than loads of bits taped together. But what I'm going to do just to explain it is I'm going to put that on there for now. What I'll do, rather than kind of doing this long-winded like previously, you know how we got this bust point. So let's just do it the same. So that was 10.5 across and 17 centimeters up from the bottom. So just draw across there. So that's basically where the bust point needs to go. And then what I need to do is just redraw in these shapes so it looks right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like before, and I'm going to lay this over the top. Just get that to line up perfectly with my dot and cross. And this time I'm going to just tape that down to stop it moving. So I can draw all of, oops. So let's just draw in that front seam, which I've lined up with a dot and cross, the centre front rather. And I can draw in this waist seam down here. Can draw up the side. So as on the previous example, that side hasn't changed. And again, I'll draw in the shoulder, which hasn't changed at all. And then my armhole, it hasn't changed, it's just moved. So you can see now these pieces, it looks quite extreme where the different positions are. So I'm going to mark my bust point here, and these dart points are the same. So that's where my seams go. So the first thing I'll do is I will just draw in the new seam positions for these. And then the last bit I need to do is my princess seam going around here. So I'm going to just trace the beginning bit of this, and then I need to bring it right over to that new position. So it's going to be a more extreme shape. What you might want to do if you are fuller on the bust is where the seam goes into the armhole, just do it slightly higher up, and it makes this shape a little bit less extreme. And then I'm going to do exactly the same on this one. And I'm going to just draw it to the new bust point. So hopefully you can see well under there. I'm going to just draw a dotted line so you can see for definite where it was, in case that doesn't show up. So that's where it was on the previous one, and this is my new shape now drawn in. So I've not added to the armhole, I've added width to the bust, I've added all the height through here, and that's my new position. But the thing that I need to check is that these are going to match up. So if I put my tape measure on the side and I measure from the armhole to the bust point, I want to keep it like that. So that measures 18.1. So I'll make a note of that. And then I'm going to do exactly the same on here. And I'm not expecting these to be the same. So that measures 17. So we've got a difference of 1.1 centimetres. So this is the shorter one and this is the longer one. What I don't want to do is make the longer one shorter. I want to make the shorter one longer. So I'm just going to extend that by 1.1 centimetres. And then I'll just redraw in the armhole shape. And that's the shape of the pattern that I now need. So I can just rub out the previous line. I'll now rub out these dotted lines. As I said, this is kind of back to front of the way I would normally do it, but I found it easier to demonstrate. So what I would do when I'm doing it, if I just grab a couple of my previous pieces, is, oops, I would just lay my pieces on the bit of paper and literally draw around them. So I now need to just draw this in a little bit heavier. And that's basically my side front and my centre front pieces. So if I just take this off, so I've just taken this little bit onto the middle, but let's just see how this compares. I need to just get this all off the table. Just going to join those two bits together so they don't move. As I say, this is not the normal way of doing things, but a better way to demonstrate, because if you understand the theory behind it, you'll be able to adapt these skills to any pattern. So if I lay that on top of there now, obviously that's all got stuck. Let's just put that on there. You can see now, you can see where the height has been added, you can see where the width's been added, and then you can see where this princess shape has been changed. So it's just more extreme than it was. Let's just take this bit off and see if we can put this back to how it was, and then I can lay the pieces on exactly as they were. And then I'll just put those back together roughly. And you can see there, let's make sure it's all in shot. You can see how that's changed. So it's the same at the bottom here and down the side seam, and it's added a lot into here and just extended it a bit there. You might have to reshape this armhole when you put it on, but that's the kind of thing where you make a sample and you correct it on your body. You can do so much on paper, but some of the stuff you need to get a sample made and look at it on your body. And then you can see here, obviously we've added the height, the shoulder and the neck are exactly the same. And if I put that there, you can see the width added in there as well. So hopefully now, looking at the two versions of where I have done this, adapting actual pattern pieces, adding the full bust in, you can now use those skills to adapt them to all sorts of patterns. You just need to remember adding to the height, adding to the width, moving the bust point, and not affecting the armhole, the shoulder, the waist and the side seam. I hope this video has answered a lot of questions. I have, as I said, had a lot of comments asking about full busts on several of my videos now, so I thought it was definitely time to do this. If there are any questions I haven't answered, then please comment below, as that could be the subject of my next tutorial. And as I said at the beginning, my bodice block tutorial that I made 8 months ago doesn't include specific details of working with a full bust, but I am going to be making that video very soon, hopefully within the next week or two, and I will include a lot more detail and also answer a lot of other questions that have come up over the last 8 months. It's only with everybody's comments and feedback that I know exactly what people want to learn. So please don't hesitate to comment below. I never take anything negatively. Whatever you say is always great feedback for me to make even more videos. So if you have enjoyed this, please check out my other pattern cutting videos. You've probably already seen my bodice block making video, but I do have others on how to use patterns, how to do adjustments, all of those things. And of course, project videos that show you how to turn your block into an actual pattern and make something that you want to wear.